know we're not going to really go over it much time, but I had kind of a getting our bearings. Where are we?
Well, I have to completely get mine because I have no idea where we are.
We're in chapter 11.
I am so confused, it's been good.
Well, we're on the schedule. If you have your book.
But then again, I was confused before all this, so I'll be honest.
Okay.
Okay.
How's Brissette this morning?
I'm good, thank you.
Good. You have one of these too?
Yeah.
Okay. Whew, there we go.
Eric, is Jennifer okay?
Yeah, she's here somewhere. She's,
The chopping club.
she was late today. Her mom had knee surgery on Wednesday. So she had to stay behind and hook up her, she has like an ice machine thing that she hooks up to her leg. So she got stuck helping out mom. But she is here.
Well, usually I get heated up when we teach, but this room's a little cool at the moment, so. Which ones turn off the fans? The pull chains or what? I don't know.
I have no idea.
You know, they had me a thing that
That's
I
the screen.
Right.
Yeah, it's just the
but,
So probably a similar thing. It's like a unit that you put ice and water in,
you got,
and then you put this thing on and like.
I don't think we need fans.
I don't think so. I don't know how you turn them off.
Well, I pulled the chain once, so hopefully they turn off. Okay, it's time for us to get started.
for each one works for each family.
We got a long ways to go and a short time to get there, but don't hum the tune behind
I
that.
was gonna say, I
Yeah.
If you're old, you know that movie. If you don't know that movie, you're not old.
yes, I know.
See you again.
Okay, I want us to start with this. I always like to start with one of those general questions about the chapter because it always helps us to get in the right frame of mind. So this Romans chapter 11, we're going to talk a little bit about the themes that are in here with it, but how did this chapter show some of Paul's people skills, particularly in managing a couple of really sets of hard messages for people who are not getting along that he wants them to have some unity? So that's the backdrop, the Jews, the Gentiles in Rome, this unity amongst them here. We've been talking a lot about issues that are here. How does chapter 11 show some of how Paul deals with that kind of a situation? What do you think? Now's the time for you to talk.
He does a great job of not allowing them to get on their high horse. He just sort of cuts them off at the knees, both groups.
Yeah,
Everyone on an equal playing field.
and in particularly in chapter 11, who does he turn to that might be an issue for them getting on their high horse? Gentiles. Because how many chapters have we been having dealing with the Jews' problems? A lot. This got erased, but somewhere, I mean, most of this he's been up through chapter 10. He's really been hammering on the Jews for their attitude and for having this attitude that we're God's special people, and he's really been telling them you're not God's only special people. And so we talked a lot about that, but this chapter he kind of brings the Gentiles up. It's almost like, lest we get a little too happy that older brother is getting punished here by the parents, let's remember some things about you. So we're going to talk about that some today. How is that helpful when we're talking about people who are not getting along? By the way, is the skill of trying to make sure everybody understands where they truly stand and what they really should be happy about, and is that useful for us today, Michelle?
Yeah, I think he does a really nice job of not picking sides, but not shying away from the hard conversations.
Yeah.
He says the hard things, but he's like, look, we're all in the same boat here. We've got different battles we're fighting, but we're all in the same boat.
And I think we'll see that as we bring this lesson out today. I think that's a good way of summarizing it. So if I gave you a couple of words to talk about what chapter 11 talks about, give me your couple of words.
grafting.
Okay, that's the easy one, right? That's what Mark chose. So we're going to talk about grafting. You mean that?
Remnant.
Remnant, that's a good word. Any others you thought of? Anything else that might be there? All right, well, that's
How about mystery?
history.
Mystery.
Mystery. Oh, I'm just looking at my notes, see if I had another word, and that was the other word. Okay.
Good job.
Hey, we're reading the same text. That's a good thing. Romans, first of all, then Mark's commentary on that. Okay, so I want us to, Mark's questions for the last few weeks have been a really good kind of outline of how to study the book. So I want us to start, and we're going to do the study today in context of his questions. I'm going to take them a little bit out of order, though, because I actually think question 2, if you looked at question 2, is a really good place to start. How does chapter 11 demonstrate God's love and commitment to save everyone who will come to him? Okay? So let me give you a little bit of a summary of what Mark's commentary pointed out for us, and it really points us back to what we've been studying over the last several weeks. Romans 9 and 10 are not happy chapters, are they? There's a lot of really dark things pointed out in Romans 9 and 10 about the Jews and about the rejection that they had given there. And in fact, though God had chosen Israel for the Messiah to come, what had Israel done when the Messiah came? They rejected him. Okay? Now, chapter 11 points out an interesting fact about this. I'm going to let you see if you noticed it here. What did the Jews' rejection of Jesus open the door for? For the Gentiles. Now, was God always going to add the Gentiles? How do we know that? What's Paul already taught us and told the Romans?
It says so in the Old Testament.
It's back in the Old Testament, back in the prophecy that your husband just talked about. Some of those prophecies point directly to the Gentiles are going to have access. And so, well, how did the Jews' rejection give the Gentiles access? Because God was going to give the Gentiles access anyway. So was it contingent on the Jews rejecting Jesus? What kind of comes through chapter 11 that maybe, for me, it was kind of an aha moment here. But what comes through chapter 11 as to what the Jews' rejection truly allowed with the Gentiles?
To be grafted in.
It absolutely allowed them to be grafted in. We're going to talk about this grafting in a minute. That it made room for them, that's for sure, Mike.
Maybe verse 32 where he says that all fell into disobedience, so he could have salvation for all.
So everybody got to realize they're in the same, that's kind of that same boat thing we talked about here.
Yeah.
We're all disobedient, therefore we all need salvation, and it's made available to all through God's what? Grace. That he makes it available to all. Look, Austin.
Just maybe along the same lines, I mean, the gospel was going to spread regardless, but it's almost like the Jews' rejection of it hastened, I'll shake the dust off the front doormat here and go over here to people who will listen, and maybe that happened a little quicker than it otherwise would have.
That was the aha I had, exactly. That Paul points out here that because the Jews rejected it, it flung the door wide open to go to the Gentiles, and it went faster than it ever could have gone had the Jews accepted it. Now that I want you to think about that a little bit. We're going to talk about that in a minute. The alternate history. Sometimes I like to read alternate histories. The alternate histories of what happens with the day of Pentecost instead of 3,000 people being saved. What if it were 3 million that it was saved? And how would things have turned out differently in doing that? And that's a little bit of what we're going to talk about when we talk about the mystery here when you look at that. Okay, so this is how this is where we're headed in chapter 11. But Paul starts us out to get us there by bringing up this incident in the life of Elijah. And what is the incident in the life of Elijah that he brings up in the first few verses here? This is question number 1 in your thing.
I'm the only one.
Okay, so we're going to talk about this remnant, and it starts off with Elijah complaining that I'm the only one. Okay. Now I want you to think a little bit about this. We're gonna use a little bit of formal logic in this today without having making it sound so much. What was Elijah saying when he said, "I'm the only one"?
I didn't understand that.
What was Elijah saying when he said, "I'm the only one"?
It depends on me.
Yeah, there might have been a little bit of that self-righteousness that was there that we've been talking about here to get out and doing that. But did Elijah have good observations? Pretty good observation. How many people were alive in Israel at the time Elijah said that? Millions. Okay? So one way to think about what Elijah said here, "I'm the only one," is basically that God, you've abandoned, there is no one here to serve you. You've rejected us all because there's no one here to serve. I'm the only one who's serving you. You've rejected everyone else. And God uses this moment to say what?
Nope.
I don't think so.
No, you're not the only one. Are there a lot of people serving? I mean, 7,000 sounds like a big number until you compare it to 3 million, right? Right? That'd be like saying, okay, we got a couple hundred here Christians today in this part of Phoenix, and there's a couple hundred. We could probably we might be able to get to what? 750 to 1,000 Christians, maybe we could name in the Phoenix area. Phoenix is how big? It's like, is Phoenix serving God this morning? No, it's not in doing that. And so God points out, no, you're not the only one. Now, I want to ask you some questions about these people. This is in the Old Testament. Were these 7,000 sinless people? Okay. What distinguished these 7,000 from the millions that Elijah had observed and who was going around that were not standing up for God? What distinguished the 7,000? If they were all sinners, what distinguished them?
They had not bowed their knee to Baal.
They didn't serve Baal, and if we flip that over to the other side of the coin, that meant they were loyal to who? How tough was it to be loyal to God in the times that they were being loyal to God? What was Jezebel and Ahab doing in Israel? Killing people. And yet these people, God says, I see them. They're not bowing the knee to Baal to avoid something happening to them. They're loyal to me. And so, whose faith might we be able to surmise God sees in these 7,000 people? What kind of faith that we've put a name to in Romans? The faith of Abraham. Total trust in the face of not understanding what's going to happen and the consequences, but just going, I trust God more than I fear the consequences of serving Him. Okay? Now, isn't that interesting? How many other times have there been a remnant when things look bleak in the world? How big was the remnant in Noah's day? It was 8. Okay. Elijah's day, 7,000 plus 1, probably plus a few more, because the Bible does say 7,000 men, so they probably were leading their families, but still. What about when Jesus was born? How big was the remnant? The people who were truly trusting God. When we look through the Gospels, how many people does it name that weren't being like the Pharisees? Not many, but there were some. Simeon and Anna were some. John's parents were some. The disciples flocked to Jesus. They weren't perfect men, but they were trusting Him in the face of all these things. How big was the remnant the day after Jesus was crucified? Was there a remnant that day? Were there a few?
Yep.
I think there were. I think those women who showed up at the tomb, they didn't understand what was happening here. They knew they believed He was the Messiah, but had they lost their faith and trust in God? I don't think they had. What about when the gospel was preached 50 days later? How big was the remnant that day? It started with the apostles. It went to 3,000, went to 5,000. By the way, Jerusalem had millions of people here. So God's point to Elijah that you're not the only one is Paul's point to us about, and it's really Paul's point to the Gentiles, who he's worried might get a little haughty about the fact that the Jews were moved out of the way so you could have access. And so that kind of had literally happened in Rome too, hadn't it? The Jews were kicked out of the city, not by the Christians, but by the Roman officials. And the Gentiles kind of had full access, and now they're almost resentful that the Jews are back, it seems, from this dialogue that's going here. And so Paul wants them to make sure you recognize that God has always worked through a remnant. And so what does that mean? God works through a remnant. What was the mistake that the Jews in Jesus' days made about thinking about themselves as the sons of Abraham? Who did they think God was going to save with a Messiah? Let me put the question that way.
The whole nation.
The nation. The Jews, but it is the whole nation. It's the nation. And I think this is interesting because I'm not sure we ever would have gotten this from studying back in the day of Elijah. What God may have meant by this, one of the things he may have meant, not only to tell Elijah to get off your keister and get back to work, there's work to be done here. He already said that to him. But he also said, these people are here. How has God always looked at saving people? Has he looked at saving people in groups as a nation?
Individually.
Did the Jews understand that throughout their history? What would be the danger for the Gentile Christians looking at this and going, well, God's favored us now, he doesn't favor you anymore? Attaching nationality, race, color, background, you name it, attaching any of those things to salvation and saying that if I'm in this group, therefore I must be saved. Oh, by the way, what's a group that we have to worry about? Wanting to have a label so that we can be saved with the group. The church. And so Paul's first lesson to them about Gentiles, you need to understand some things, is that God has always looked at individuals. And the fact that a lot of individuals reject him doesn't mean that all individuals rejected him. And if there's a remnant, who's going to be at work through the remnant? God's going to be at work through the remnant. And now he's about to point out to them in the rest of Romans 11 just exactly what was accomplished. What was God accomplishing with the remnant? And how did that benefit the Gentiles? And why they should ultimately be humble about that. Okay, let me stop for a minute. Does that make sense? Comments, thoughts, questions about that?
Going back a little bit on that, Paul was a Jew, but he says, I'm an apostle to the Gentiles. And one of my motivations was to provoke you to jealousy, that you might change.
That's exactly right. I mean, we're going to talk about that a little bit more in a minute, but Paul actually said, when Paul flips this around, because he's really going to tell the Gentiles, even if the Jews rejecting Jesus opened the door for you, that doesn't mean God's permanently rejected them. And as good a news as it is for you, it's also good news for them. And that's one of the things Paul points out. It's almost like Paul said, I made the Jews have to react to me because some of them might actually have some conscience and come back to the Lord. Oh, by the way, who's a Jew who did that? Who's a Jew who initially rejected Jesus? And by getting all worked up and upset, started thinking about these, and ultimately God pulled him back in here. It's almost as if Paul's saying, yeah, I know this can happen. That first verse of chapter 11, has God rejected the Jews? The answer to that question is certainly not. And who's his example to prove that God hadn't rejected the Jews?
Here I am.
Here I am. And everything about him, good and bad, got to put behind him so he could actually accomplish this. So excellent thought here. Now he talks about in order, we're going to get to grafting here pretty quickly because I want to spend some time on that. But in order for this grafting process to happen, something had to happen to the Jews. And he uses a word about that. It's a scary word, and it's in question number 3. Hardening. The Jews had to be hardened. Okay, what's that mean from your study? They were hardened.
It means being blinded by your own prejudice.
Okay? They were certainly, they came to the point at which they could not see what God was doing, right? That's being blinded. Jesus talked about that. Your ears hear, but you don't listen. Your eyes see, but you don't understand. This hardening of God's presenting the facts he's presenting to you, and you don't respond to them. In fact, the end of chapter 10, God said the way the Messiah came was a what to the Jews? A stumbling block. Because they had chosen to see the world in one way, when God did something a different way, they just tripped over it. And that's, Paul gives it a word, it's being hardened, okay?
And I think complacent comes to my mind too, and I think that's something we have to worry about today. They thought they had it, we don't have to do anything, we've got it made.
They
That
did.
doesn't work.
Well, verse 8. He quotes from Isaiah, God gave them a spirit of stupor so they should not see. Okay, who are some people that God has hardened besides the Jews that we read about in the Bible? Hardened Pharaoh. Hardened his people in Israel. Who were hardened in Jesus' day? Jesus used the same language too. What kind of people were hardened in that? Jesus said, who was he talking about? They hear and they cannot understand. Pharisees, Sadducees, the religious leaders of the time, they were hardened. We find out that those who refuse to love the truth are hardened in 2 Thessalonians. People are even sent a strong delusion. Who is behind this hardening? According to God is behind this hardening. Now, let me ask you this question. Give me an example, or let me ask you to come to the list. Give me an example of a faithful person that God has hardened. Are there any in the Bible?
No.
Who does God harden?
Those who make the first move.
They do.
The
ones that choose to reject.
They choose to reject him. They have had the evidence. They've examined the evidence. I mean, think about Pharaoh. How much evidence did Pharaoh have? Who he was dealing with. And he goes, eh. So after he did it enough times, God was like, okay, we'll let these guys do some snake things and some other things, just to send him on down the path here in looking at that. If God would harden the Jews, would God harden us today?
And for the same reason.
Arrogance.
So this is just a quick application lesson before we jump into into agronomy here, whatever they call tree science. What do we do to assure that we can avoid being the ones who are hardened? What do we need to assure about ourselves so that we aren't an example later on of God saying, so I hardened Greg to get to this other result. He made himself available for me to use by refusing to bow down to my will. Therefore, he was hardened so that he would believe this. I don't want that to be said of me. What do I do to avoid that?
Stay humble.
Humility is number one, is to recognize that if I'm following God, I can't always understand exactly where he's leading me, and that's okay. I'm just going to keep following. That humility is a key part of it. What else do you think about?
Self-reflection, being honest.
Absolutely, being honest. Why am I doing these
Your
things?
heart, your behavior, your choices.
That's right. Who am I doing these things to be seen by? We talked about that last week. That's where the Jews, they got to where it was a public performance versus truly a matter of the heart. And Jesus talks about that. What else?
We have to remember that judgment belongs to God, and we've got to love everybody.
We do. When we start seeing people as groups, when I start seeing myself as in some group that's better than some other group, those are the kind of people that God hardened here. And so when we see that God uses this, and we may or may not get to this exactly by the end of class today, looking at the clock, but Paul will later point out that God hardened Israel, but he really partially hardened Israel. And so the question is, how do I stay on that side so I'm not in that group? And I think that's a good thing for us to think about, because I was looking here, verse 11 gives us, I think, maybe the clue from the passage of what to do. Paul asked in Romans 11:11, I ask you, did they stumble in order that they may fall? Okay, he's talking about the Jews. What do you think? Did God set them up to trip because he just needed somebody to trip, and so he just set them up to trip? Why does Paul say in the rest of the verse that they stumbled? Was it because God needed them to fall, or was it for another reasons?
For the rebound when they come back. Sometimes you have to hit bottom before you realize that you need to turn back the other way.
That's true. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But in verse 11, why does he say they stumbled? Was it because God hardened them?
Opportunity presented for the Gentiles as a result.
So we're going to talk about that as well. Verse 11 says because of their what? Rather through what? Through their transgression, through their trespass. Okay? What was this trespass that caused them to stumble, which allowed God to harden them? What was the trespass? In Elijah's day, what was the trespass that allowed the nation to stumble that was here, that they committed, that the remnant didn't commit?
Worshipping other gods.
Well, that was a trespass, but there's a heart, we go to the heart of the matter here. The trespass that the Jews had committed here,
Self-serving.
Rejection.
self-serving,
Self-serving.
their self-righteousness.
Arrogance. Yeah.
Or their arrogance. I think that is exactly where he's taking us here. It wasn't that the remnant is sinless. It wasn't that God was punishing them because they had some sins. The 7,000 weren't sinless, but what were they not? They weren't self-righteous and arrogant. They weren't deciding that my ways is as good as God's ways, and I feel okay about what I'm doing, so I'm justified by that. And I actually think that's one of the things he's pointing to, because he's going to get to the Gentiles here in just a second and say, don't you become arrogant. Because that is the place that took them down this road, was that self-righteousness, that believing that I can do enough, that he just kind of owes me the salvation.
The
And
version says they went blind staring in the mirror. So they're just all about themselves.
they're absolutely are all about themselves and about what God owes them, instead of recognizing what Paul says here. I pulled the verse up to look at it here, but when Paul says, if God has given us something through grace, is works ever a part of it? Works can't be a part of it. If God gave us salvation, then we can't work for it. So don't fool yourself into thinking you're good enough for it. Don't act like that, because you're not.
They were stubborn people also, very
And-
stubborn.
And stubbornness,
Yeah, that's a good one.
and were they stubborn before, or was that the result of God hardening them? Who can know the test on that?
They were also complacent. They may not have had that active arrogance, but they were happy with their status quo. They said, we're saved, that's done, moving on. They were complacent and not searching, but their eyes were not seeing, their ears were not hearing, they were not actively seeking to stay faithful.
So we're gonna move from this, but if we want to be a part of the remnant in the time that we live, that God's working through, we have to make sure we don't end up here. We have to end up trusting God, and we talked about that enough here. Okay, I was gonna ask you to talk about grafting, but I'm gonna read you something here. After I looked this up, it's like, okay, this is interesting. So I just went to an AI engine and said, tell me about the process of grafting. After reading all this about grafting. And Mark actually asked you question 4 to go do that. So this is what I went and did. So I just pulled what it said here, condensed it here. Placing branches from one tree onto a growing tree so that The tree and the grafted branches are sustained together by the tree roots. That's what grafting is, okay? Why do you graft? This is just according to a Chat GPT engine. You want to propagate the desired traits in the tree and its fruit. Disease resistance. Create trees that grow in environments and soils where they otherwise might not grow. Change the size of the tree. Speed up the maturation of the tree. Then there was how do you graft? You take a branch from a tree having desired trait, prepare it to put it in close contact, receiving nourishment from the roots. You make space for it so it's got space to get light and to grow. You join it in, you secure the graft, you protect that graft from pests and from drying out, and you wait for the new branch to actually show signs of its own life coming off the tree. What are the challenges of grafting? Compatibility. Not all plants are compatible with each other, even in the same species. Skill. Grafting requires precision and can have a very steep learning curve. Disease transfer. There's a risk of transferring diseases when you graft. You have to be sure that you're taking healthy material and putting it in. Okay? This is what people today in the world know about grafting. Paul uses the example of grafting to point the picture. So somebody tell me the quick story of grafting here, and then we're going to dive into some of the things. If you were to retell these 10 or 12 verses about grafting, so tell us what God did with the Jews, what God did with the Gentiles, and what the result is for that. And just give me a quick summary so I can let my voice rest a second.
Grafted in the Gentiles to try to make both of them healthy and strong and vigorous.
Where did he put the Gentiles in at? What had to happen before the Gentiles could be grafted in?
Cut off.
Jews got cut off.
Had to have some space. Broke off some branches, right? And those were Jews. Okay, what else? What about else about the grafting?
The grafted root or branches can be cut off.
The grafted branches can be cut off too. What about the branches that were broken off?
They can be grafted back in.
They can be put back in,
But there's only one tree.
but there's only one tree,
And one root system.
which is one root system, which is one source. And so to be a part of that tree, what do you surmise from that? You have to be able to be nourished by
The roots.
that root. And if you have nourished yourself by another root, you're going to be compatible? No. So guess what the horticulturist is going to do?
The graft won't take.
Graft won't take. I'm not going to waste my time on this graft. That one won't take. What about the branch that he pulled off? Could the branch that he pulled off of the tree, the domesticated olive tree, could it have grown on the olive tree? It could have. But something was wrong with it. Until that got fixed, it really couldn't grow. And so it was taken out. By the way, did Jesus use a similar example on another plant?
Clay.
Vine and branches.
Potter and clay, vine and branches, I was thinking specifically, but the same sort of thing. By the way, potter and clay is going to show up in teen weekend. So I'm the vine, you're the branches, and then he talks about the branches being cut off. Talks about his tree growing and providing shade, so think about kind of what grafting does and what God was trying to do. Now let's put Paul's interpretation on it. Paul is talking specifically to his Gentile brethren in Rome, and he says, the Jews are the branches that were broken off to make room for you. And you were the wild olive, and you were grafted in. So what's the problem here? That was a happy thing for them, right? What happens when humans get happy news from the Lord sometimes? Oh, I must be special.
Get too comfortable.
I'm better than they were. And do we know that was a problem here? Well, Paul says don't become arrogant. So it must have been a problem that they were starting to think. And for the Roman Jews, now play this one out for yourself and the Gentiles. This little grafting exercise, which is a nice philosophical thing to talk about grafting, how did that actually come down in Rome over their history. Remember the setup? Where was the space made for the Gentiles to grow?
They got ripped away. I mean, the Roman, or the Jews got ripped away.
Yeah, it wasn't because of the specific Roman Jewish Christians issues in the church that they got ripped away, but they got ripped away. Space was made for the Gentiles, and what did the Gentiles do in that 5 to 7 years when the Romans were gone? They grew. And now all of a sudden the Jews are coming back in and go, I need to break this off and make the space for me again. Well, what should have been the Jews' conclusion about this? My brethren are stronger, therefore what? The church is stronger, the tree is bigger, there's room for more branches. Let's don't talk about breaking off and doing that. The Gentiles are getting this move over, let me back in, are reacting to this as, I don't want to move over, I don't want to let you in. And Paul is pointing out to them two very specific things. You can't go down the same path your Jewish brethren went down to enable you to be taken here. And number two, recognize that God can put in this tree whatever individuals that are his remnant to make it grow. Because God's the one growing this tree. He's putting in and he's taking out as he will. Be someone God wants you to be in. So don't be arrogant, and recognize that if you are, God will make room for somebody else in his tree by clipping you off his branch. And you'll be in the exact same boat here. And then he attaches, for the last 5 minutes, this last word to all of this. He attaches mystery. So tell me what is there about the mystery that he gives them? And it really comes out of this warning that he gives to the Gentiles to make sure your attitude stays the attitude of trusting God and not the attitude of trusting yourself, being arrogant. So first of all, what is the mystery? 11:25, if you forgot where you read it in the chapter. Lest you be wise in your own sight, I do not want you to be unaware of the mystery, brothers. A partial hardening has come upon Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. First of all, when we see the word mystery in the Bible, what does that mean?
Something that needs to be explained clearly to us by God, or revealed.
It needs to be explained, but it needs to be really revealed. Is there ability to understand a Bible mystery without revelation? Are there a lot of remaining Bible mysteries out there? What's going on in all the galaxies and what did God tell us about it? He tells us nothing about all that. There's all kinds of mysteries that are there. This is a mystery relevant to them. And the mystery is what? That God did what?
Move some Jews out of the way so the Gentiles could.
Until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. That God partially hardened the Jews until the Gentiles could come in. And then when the Gentiles had come in, what did God want to have happen?
The rest of the Jews come in.
The rest of the Jews, as many as would, as many who had the characteristics of trusting God, to be able to come in. And in fact, Paul says, the way I preach is really trying to incite them to think about these things so that they will be challenged by this. They will see what the Gentiles have as they have accepted the Messiah and everything he means. And they'll ultimately decide, I was wrong with this self-righteous, arrogant attitude. I need to rethink this because I want what God is giving here through the nation in doing that. And so for the most part, the Jews started off having pride in their privileged status as God's people. That led them, that pride, P.S., listen to the sermon coming up in the next hour, that pride led them to self-righteousness, thinking that they could work and God would owe them if they were just good law keepers as they wanted to be. They stumbled over the Messiah, and most of them failed to accept him when he came. They were broken off as the branches. God used this fact to open the door for the Gentiles, not only to have access, but for the gospel to spread rapidly to the Gentiles. Quick aside here. The 3,000 on Pentecost, were they all from Jerusalem? without Jerusalem inhabitants? They're all Jews, right? Where'd they live?
He had traveled in.
How many languages did the apostles have to speak? There's a long list of languages. Almost like it was a setup, wasn't it? To get the gospel out as quickly as possible into the regions where, when these people left Jerusalem and they went back to their home regions, they were in the minority as far as Jews. So who were they surrounded by? Gentiles. And God was using that to open the door. The Gentiles took advantage of this and they were grafted in, forever changing the definition of God's people. Up until that point, the Jews had said God's people meant something about a nation. And God fully demonstrated, no, my people are about an attitude. My people are the people who trust me. And if you trust me and you do your best to follow my will because you trust me, you're my people. And those are the people that I will help, and I will help grow and do that. So a little bit more we can talk about here. Second bell is here. So I think this is it's a wonderful way for Paul to, this back and forth between the Gentiles and the Jews, for him to ultimately get them to the point of saying, folks, we're on the same team. We're nourished by the same God. Take that nourishment and do his will, and watch what he'll do through us. Watch what he'll do by working through us.
Just real quick, I know we're done, but in Ephesians